Over the next few minutes, I'm just going to attempt to describe and convey something of the research involved in and generated by writing the summaries and essays for this project. Members, as Simon has said, of the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project have put an extraordinary amount of effort. They're all going to be really modest about it later, but it's a huge amount of effort and talent into producing introductory summaries for each volume of the Board of Longitude archive that's been digitised. They've also put together a series of thematic essays on key actors, objects, institutions and events which function to accompany and then further introduce the digitised volumes. More has been learnt, both about the process of digitisation and the Board of Longitude itself, than can possibly fit into this, thankfully, short talk. So I hope that I'm just going to present a few ideas and highlight some of what we found, and then discuss how it shaped the course of our research as both a team and individuals, and then perhaps reflect on what Tim's been saying and talk about some of the perks and potential pitfalls that we encountered on this sort of journey. So, to begin with, the question, what is actually present in the Board of Longitude archive and associated papers, seems like a good place to start. The digitised volumes collected in this website are an incredibly rich resource and give insight into more than just the Board of Longitude and the problem of longitude at sea. Yet, the Board of Longitude is still, of course, at the core of many of these volumes, so no doubt, Dava Sobel's familiar narrative of Harrison and longitude has helped attract interest to this material, and that narrative is both substantially enriched and very firmly challenged by the archive that's now available online. The board was established after the passing of this Act, 1714. I'm sorry for the dodginess of some of these images. They were screenshot by me a long time ago. There are beautiful editions of these on that website there, so the irony of this is not lost on me. So between this Act in 1714 and the disappearance of the board in the late 1820s, it accumulated a vast quantity of correspondence, mariners' logbooks, information detailing voyages and experiment, new instruments and theories for longitude, as well as for navigation more generally. All these papers were gathered together into approximately 60 volumes by this man, rather dapper Astronomer Royal, George Biddle Airy, and he did this in the 1850s and 60s. And to this collection, this project has added papers from two Astronomer Royals, Neville Maskelyne and John Pond. We don't have a photo of him. I'm not a bad researcher, or a portrait of him, so I've just given you his signature, and that's obviously Neville Maskelyne. We've also added figures that were supported in their activities by the Board of Longitude, who produced substantial amounts of research. So the Reverend George Fisher is one that I wrote quite a lot about, and he was obviously the astronomer and chaplain in David Buchanan's 1818 voyage into the Arctic and William Edward Perry's voyage in 1821. So he worked with, and I quote Perry, unabated zeal and perseverance. So his archive is incredibly rich. There's also additional logbooks and manuscripts that are from the National Maritime Museum, but I won't list them. They're all there for you to see. Links are also offered to images and descriptions of objects held at Greenwich, as we've discussed, and to relevant archives and other collections, the Royal Society, for example. Together, these papers provide an extraordinary insight into the relations between science and the state, into British and overseas innovation, the nature of scientific travel and exploration, and comparisons of privileged and field sites of scientific work. More specifically, this collection gives insight into the extremely complex network of skills present in Georgia and Britain, and particularly in London. The correspondence and schemes found in these volumes throws light on the artisanship and creativity, some rational, some not so rational, which flourished in the 18th and early 19th century. The balance of digitised archives lies very much in the later period of the board's programme, so after the termination of the Harrison, sorry Dava, in the 1770s. This is material that scholars have really not used very much, and it raises fascinating questions in the historiography of the sciences, as well as artisanship and global networks. So this is really a big volume of information that has been hugely underused. In a series of acts from the 1770s after Harrison onwards, culminating in 1818, so here's a couple of them. Again, those are my dodgy images. There's beautiful ones online, which are there for you to zoom in on. It's really astounding. And in these acts from the 1770s, the remit of interest of the Board of Longitude was drastically expanded, and these volumes directly produced by the board in this period remind us of its role in many other things. So the establishment of the Cape Observatory and the pursuit of the Northwest Passage, the development of navigational techniques, magnetism, improving compasses, all this stuff is in there. In this later period, the board had effectively become the first government body with the delightfully and blissfully vague remit of improving navigation. And it is here, I wrote the quote down, or other, it's very vague, or other useful and discoveries and improvements in navigations. Now, no government body has been given such a vague remit ever. I challenge you to bring me one. So between the correspondence, administrative and personal records, the logbooks and reports, in these pages lies an unprecedented rich picture of what culture was like in the age of reform, revolution, and industrialization. So, right, drum beating, done. No such digitisation project can function without rich, detailed, and accurate metadata. Texts and tools that guide users around the site and offer usable commentary on the online materials are completely essential for engaging with this. This has been the challenge met by team members from the Arts and Humanities Research Council project. In this process of examining all this material, in order to summarise it in the metadata that accompanies each volume, many unexpected insights were gained. Many such insights were entirely unexpected when we first approached the material, and therefore have changed significantly the shape of conclusions as well as the course of research in our project. What we found more often than not exceeded our expectations in terms of insight. So the few examples I have for you now are just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. There's many, many more. So the board's repositories became a major collection for incoming schemes of the wildest possible scopes, as I've said, ranging from navigational devices and cartographic innovations to projects in maths, mechanics, magnetism, astronomy. Indeed, for some critics, such as Admiralty Secretary John Croker, the very breadth and frequent eccentricity of the schemes that reached the board was one of the reasons he used to shut it down. First, therefore, I want to show you some of the letters and diagrams of perpetual motion machines that come into the board. That's RGO 1454, labels under Airy's later dispensation as Correspondence on Perpetual Motion and Quadrature of the Circle. So there's one. Let's see if someone can build it. Little historical or scholarly work has ever been done into the thinking behind, the social place of, and the reception of work on perpetual motion in the early to mid-19th century. So this archive has encouraged me to return to the work done on perpetual motion in the 18th century, then attempt to plot a space for this kind of work in the 19th century in a sort of scientific and bureaucratic discourse. The discovery of this work has led me to similar letters held at the Royal Society. I have started to form conclusions about how men of science often attempt to hide behind institutional roles rather than engage in scientific debate, as the scientific community stratified and formed a hierarchy during this age of reform and crisis and restructuring in science and politics. A particularly telling quotation that demonstrates this phenomenon comes from the board secretary Thomas Hurd in a letter sent to the author of a perpetual motion scheme in the March of 1812. See, that's a bit better, that one. The letter itself is quite an interesting piece of bureaucracy, given what Hurd probably thought about the likelihood of the successful invention of a perpetual motion machine. So the fact he's engaging with the author is in itself relatively interesting. This exists. That's cool and interesting. Hurd writes, and I quote for you here, "I have to inform you that as the discovery of a perpetual motion has nothing to do with the discovery of the longitude, the commissioners did not think it necessary to take your letters into consideration." That's one of the more polite letters that Board of Longitude writes. But he's not saying, oh no, perpetual motion can't exist because perpetual motion can't exist, and engaging in a scientific debate. He's hiding behind the administration. So this is really fascinating for my doctoral research. I didn't anticipate that this particular volume would be so relevant to my work in its connections between bureaucracy and science in the Regency period, but the depth with which I had to go through this volume to be surveyed for the digitisation project led me to this new avenue of work. I am not the only person, cue shameless name dropping, about to start, that has additional interests on the new has new interests or a new depth in their research as a result of this work. And other members of the project team have been kind enough to provide me with examples of significant archival finds that only came to their attention as a result of doing this being involved with this digitisation project. Alexi Baker, who is somewhere here, There she is. She's lovely. Talk to her later. Is one of the project's postdoctoral researchers and has highlighted in a series of blog posts, which you can read in our blog, talking of social engagement. Through her, she's highlighted some of her thoughts on female projectors, particularly this lady, Elizabeth Johnson, and Jane Squire as well. And this has been digitised in its entirety by the team. So that's good. The large quantity of receipts that are also present in the volumes of the Board of Longitude had shaped Alexi's understanding, so she tells me, of the board's dealings and interactions with instrument makers, as well as highlighting the vulnerability of so-called hardware in the constant commissioning of repairs. She's managed to map and build this understanding of this network of interaction. It's completely amazing. Katie Barrett, who's there, she's also fabulous, talk to her as well, is a fellow PhD and has discovered a poem, which I don't attempt to read, in the archive that illustrates extremely well the narrative of madness associated with the longitude problem over the long 18th century, which is one of the core themes of her doctoral work. And if I'm right in thinking, she was thinking about this madness stuff and then discovered this afterwards and was sort of like eureka moment in the archive. So finally, Ern Phillips, who is sitting slightly behind her, who's also completely brilliant, told me that he has discovered things that he might otherwise have missed as well. So of particular interest is how the Board of Longitude employed its own history when engaging with claims and schemes after it was firmly established. So specifically, Owen discovered an interesting case where the board used the early 18th century work of Jeremy Thacker to show that the work of a clockmaker in 1809, 100 years after Thacker's work, was not original and therefore rendered his patents unsuccessful. So Jeremy Thacker, for those of you who are not clued up, is of Beverley and appeared in 1714 as the author of a brief text entitled The Longitude Examined, an early scheme for a kind of clock to determine longitude at sea. Here you can see it's in a vacuum. His publication elicited many responses from other 18th century projectors, and it caused a huge storm. And it's been recently authoritatively suggested by Pat Rogers that Thacker is satirical fiction. The invention of the scriblarian medic, a man of letters, John Arbuthnot. So, I mean, others have pointed out that Thacker's text does contain much well-grounded horological work, so that just shows us that what we're digitising here and engaging with is right at the cutting edge of research. So, Owen has found that Thacker's project was used by the commissioners of the Board of Longitude a century after its first publication in a meeting on the 2nd of March 1809 as a result of writing a summary for these minutes for the project. The person being questioned, as I said before, is the clockmaker John Manton, who had 2 patents covering his vacuum device in 1807. And it's just really tragic because they say, like, are you aware the idea of this is not new? And Jeremiah Thacker of Beverley in Yorkshire, London, he did this first. And his little response, which I didn't manage to squidge in, was, no, I did not. So, anyway, seeing the Board of Longitude use its own narratives in its deliberation helps us to reflect on the process of rewriting its history yet again. In the process of producing metadata for this website, we're reminded that we are not, in this moment, creating anything definitive. That isn't to say that we're not confident in our conclusions about the material, but that we're aware of the fact this is just the latest version. The metadata on this website, unlike published work, is perpetually updatable. The narrative can change, it can alter, it can adapt. Furthermore, there is something interesting in comparing the board's institutional memory of its own interactions, along with our own use or neglect of this archive, and reflecting on our use and all of those who've been using it between our time and that of George Airy. So this brings us to the second part of this talk, yes, we're on time, where I'll quickly discuss how over the course of producing the summaries and essays we came across, not only did we learn lots of new things about the Board of Longitude, but there were some extraordinary consequences of doing this work with regard to digitisation. There were many potential pitfalls in this kind of project. Tim has spoken about some of them. The main one being potentially the loss of materiality when staring at a letter on the screen. The digitisation process has transformed these manuscripts and printed pages from objects, which strangely enough were typically treated as text rather than object in the first place, into images, and has caused members of the team to reflect on how they interact with this archive prior to and during digitisation. Our encounters with the Board of Longitude paper, to begin with, often saw us treat them as text, rather than thing, taking for granted the additional textual components of the archive, skipping over the address side of letters, not worrying about the blanks in the volumes or the pretty, but pointless, perhaps, illustrations found on some diagrams. obsessed with content, we, or at least I'll single myself out here, plundered the volumes at the start of our research, concerned mostly with text despite the presence of the object in front of me. The process of digitizing, that's not a word, the process of digitizing the archive has, rather than losing this materiality, highlighted it. Digitization performed as it has been on this project actually draws attention to the materiality of the text in front of you. Clicking through the pages, we are forced to see the page of text, the address, the illustration, all on the same level. Each one precisely rendered and beautifully scanned regardless of its content. Skimming through the digital archive becomes a more thoughtful and reflective activity as you click through. You can't just whip through the pages and be like, where's that letter, where's that letter? You have to click through. I don't know if you designed it like that, but you do. And so it becomes a more thoughtful and reflective activity than when turning the pages of the original volume. The work that's gone into this project has done a fantastic job of demonstrating that archives are not simply text and has incorporated that point directly into these reproductions. The metadata produced also actively engages with and discusses the materiality of the volumes. For example, several summaries draw attention to the limitations of paper as a communication device in the Georgian period. Here we can see how this image is, I think, and please someone tell me what is going on here. I think this is an image that's drawn in both 2 and 3 dimensions. So he's drawn the face of this clock, and this is a compass that he talks about sticking into it, but he's had to draw it like that. So paper is not a brilliant communication device all the time, right? And that's highlighted here. Digitization has drawn attention to the marginal notes that litter the board and associated papers. So, for example, only when I started looking at these images did I realise the consistency with which Thomas Young, the secretary from 1818 to 1828, wrote on the top of letters. So here's some that I pulled up from RGO 1437, and you can see here, quite cutting, some of them. These are quite friendly, these ones, compared to some of the others, but he's got, at the top of this one, Watson, nothing new. John Tyrrell Bailey, again. And then this one just says longitude, star, and he has his own system of abbreviations. So this was a letter about Polaris, and he writes this word. Does that look like Polaris to you? It looks like to me. But he consistently writes this if anything's got anything to do with Polaris. So he's developing a filing system that I didn't see until we digitized this archive. So the bigger potential problem, potentially even larger than the materiality issue, facing the digitization process is fixing, as I mentioned in the title of this talk. When a collection is digitized, it becomes still. It's frozen, and with the further risk of its current order being perceived as somehow authoritative or correct, or the intended order of that archive. The Board of Longitude archives were put into these volumes by George Biddle in the 1840s and 50s, as we've heard. Airy was, of course, notorious as archivist. The Victorian mathematician Augusta Morgan reckoned Airy is the prince of Methodists, and my theory is that he dries his pen on blotting paper, he makes a duplicate by the pressing machine, files and indexes it. So he is quite rigorous. It's therefore slightly unsurprising that Airy sought to impose order on this collection when he inherited it, but perhaps uncharacteristically, Airy didn't do a particularly thorough job of organising the Longitude archive. Stop the press. So here we have a note that says, in this packet are several letters from persons sending plans for finding the longitude, which should more properly be placed with their other papers. For the present, they may remain here. So what this highlights, I think, is that we don't want to presume that there is an order in which this archive is meant to be. There is no proper order for these papers. At no point in their life, at first production, or filing away as historic artefact, was there a definitive order given to them. So this problem of fixing is really present, I think, in this volume more so than others. But I think it's arrested by the digitization process when accompanied by well-researched metadata. With the ability to cross-reference and hyperlink, which carries users of the site from one place in the archive to another, as well as to entirely different archives, the Board of Longitude papers are finally liberated from Airy's bindings. Cross-referencing is essential to engaging properly with the Board of Longitude archive, and the mapping of crossover of actors, instruments, schemes will be a highly fruitful endeavour, hopefully, and will result in further engagement with this issue of fixing. It's important to remember, I suppose, that Airy's organisation is still present in these papers. You know, you have to click on the volumes as you go through the website. And I think that's important. I think we do need to preserve the categories that he created, as they're significant for how we read and interpret individual schemes and how we regard their, it helps us create perhaps some actor categories for the Board of Longitude shortly after its end. This collection of papers is a contingent assemblage of materials from the 18th and 19th centuries, and thus remind us how such assemblages work in the past to achieve practical ends, whilst reminding us too that such collections can always be reordered and reactivated for different purpose. So the main conclusion, I could just put the proper website up I suppose, is that the main conclusion I want to draw for you today is that the production of this site required and still requires a large quantity of historical research into this archive, which at points is both extremely broad and extremely deep. The summaries do more than summarise. They contextualise, they comment, and hopefully provoke thought in the end users of this site. Yet it's also important to remember that this is an open-ended project. There is a future. Research as this website is maintained and added to is going to be key to keeping this alive. We haven't just created a static end product that will slowly become outdated. The content of the essays and the website as a whole will be maintained and periodically updated. So that means that look at it, read it, but more than that, interact with it. If you find something that you think is wrong, or you don't like our conclusion, or you think that there's something else that's significant in the archive that we've missed, you can tell us, and the website will evolve and change. Okay? We might disagree, but that's... This website is going to change the way that we understand 18th and early 19th century scientific activity and its place in Georgian politics, culture and life, and will continue to do so as others come to interact with this website. So please do engage. Thank you.